for Black Girl Nerds.
Thank you so much for your efforts on this project. I really, really learned a lot. This is a part of media history and TV history that I truly knew nothing about, with Harry Belafonte blazing another trail that goes unnoticed by so many people. During the project, everyone talks about how they didn't know about this history because there was no tape except for a couple of episodes, and then maybe a guy had a couple of audio versions. What was the most surprising about this discovery as you became involved with this project about Harry Belafonte and his involvement with The Tonight Show?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I am also a fan of Black Girl Nerds. I feel like I'm like the shadow president of Black Girl Nerds because I've been a Black Girl Nerd my entire life. So I love it. And I love what you guys do.
Thank you.
Of course. And so, well, I learned about this the same way that a lot of people do. I didn't know about it at all. And Joan Walsh, who's a friend, my former editor and pal, we're walking through 30 Rock, and she tells me about this piece that she'd written for The Nation. And it was around the time of Harry Belafonte's birthday, just commemorating this week. And I had no idea. I'd never heard of it. I thought I knew a lot about Harry Belafonte, his civil rights work, his work in television and music. My mother had all of his albums growing up. She was the biggest fan, Harry Belafonte fan on earth. So I thought I knew a lot about him, but I didn't know this. And so I thought to myself, well, if I didn't know, a lot of people didn't know. And I said to her, I think this will be a great documentary. And so we went to our friend Valerie Thomas, who has made some incredible documentaries. She had the documentary history. So we were like, how do we make this into a film? And the first thing we started doing was looking for footage. And it turned out there was almost none. That, back in those days in the 1960s, they used to tape over. They would just tape the shows out, and then they would just reuse the tape. And so there's very little left of this project. And so what little we had, thankfully, included snippets of the Dr. King interview and the Robert Kennedy interview, but that's pretty much all that was left. And so then the question is, well, how do you make a documentary out of that? And so that was kind of the process and the creative process of figuring out how do you extend this incredible story that people really need to know into a full documentary. And so we kind of took it from there. When Yoruba, who's the director, got involved, she took it to the next level in terms of the creativity. But yeah, we were telling a story that I didn't know either.
I think about that time. My brother was born in 1968, and so my mom was a little busy with that, so she didn't have very much recollection of that. And I wish my father was still living, because he was super duper about Harry Belafonte and being active in the cause and all of those things. With as involved, it was mentioned that he raised the most money for civil rights efforts. Why haven't we learned more about Harry Belafonte? We see bits and pieces, but never really a whole comprehensive story like this about him, to a degree, of his civil rights efforts. Is he shy about that when you speak to him? Is he very humble about it? And is it something he's for, a whole comprehensive study of his life?
Well, no, he's not shy. Harry Belafonte is one thing, but he's definitely not shy. And he is very humble. He is not shy, but he is extremely humble. But no, I think the reason we don't know it is that we tend to compartmentalize people. We say this person is a celebrity, this person is an activist. We don't really see the nuances in all of these people's multivariate personalities and the things that they've done. Look, I knew, because my father immigrated to the United States in the early 1960s from the Congo, and the program that John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, put together to bring people from these newly independent African nations to the United States, that Barack Obama's father came on, that my father came on. Harry Belafonte funded it, right? I knew that he had he put money into that program. He helped bring, a lot of our parents over here, those of us who have immigrant backgrounds. So I knew that. I knew that he had put money into the March on Washington, before this documentary. He was somebody who didn't just talk about civil rights or march at the March on Washington. He actually showed up with his checkbook. He was one of those celebrities, and there were a lot of them, who really stepped forward to fund the civil rights movement, because those buses don't run on on hope, you know,
Right.
you need
Right.
money for gas. And so he was one of those celebrities that was extremely active. You know, we talk about woke celebrities now, but back then being woke really meant also taking risks with your career, with predominantly white audiences being willing to boycott you and try to destroy your career. There weren't that many Black people with a lot of power and influence in Hollywood. And so to risk your career in that way, to be on the side of civil rights. And you think about, you know, Nina Simone suffered terribly for being outright and saying, you know, Mississippi, G damn, she did that and her career, you know, started to tank. So it was a risk. And so I think it's important to know this about Harry Belafonte, to know that when he got the chance to be on an entertainment show, because Johnny Carson's show was informative, but it was primarily an entertainment show.
Right.
And Harry Belafonte was known as an entertainer. So for him to take that week and say, you know what I'm going to do with this week? I'm going to interview Dr. King. I'm going to interview Robert Kennedy Jr. I'm going to ask them tough questions. I'm going to talk about civil rights in a way that will make this predominantly white audience uncomfortable. That was revolutionary and deserves to be known.
Absolutely. And just the like mentioned, the consumption of it. You're going to bed at night and the last things you're seeing is Black faces in a white space talking about civil rights and other topics that make you uncomfortable when you're used to seeing maybe like someone doing the Watusi or the twist or whatever, you know, people were doing back then. That in itself is incredible. Even just the fact that of all the content, there was a tremendous guest list from Diane Carroll to Lena Horne to, I mean, just a crazy number of people who were guests on the show, but the ones that survived were those two. Do you think secretly, maybe it was by design, were those the most important of the interviews, or in a time where everything was taped over, how did those manage to survive?
I think that people at least were wise enough to know that they really should not delete anything with Dr. King and Robert Kennedy Jr. I think maybe someone in the back of their mind thought we need to keep these. But I mean, the people who were on the show, I mean, these were Mr. Belafonte's friends. You know, these were the people that he was hanging with. These were the people that he was talking civil rights with, you know, at their homes. These are the people who were in his home where they were all planning to support the civil rights movement. This was the Black Lives Matter movement of the 1960s. It was just 50 years earlier, but it was the same movement. And so you even see today, you have a lot of people who are very active celebrity voices and faces. You know, my friend of Yvette Nicole Brown is very active, very, you know, prominent in the movement. There are people who are using their voices today that are also celebrities. So that's not a new thing. It's just that back then, as you said, unfortunately, these shows tended to tape over and reuse the tapes. It was a limited, finite resource. And so you didn't see people, you know, keeping the Dionne Warwick episode, you know, it didn't happen. Unfortunately, because can you imagine how valuable and how incredible that footage would be? I really wish I could sort of transport myself back to that time and just watch that week myself.
It's absolutely incredible. And I'm trying to envision a time in 1968 where Harry Belafonte goes into 30 Rock and says, hey, okay, I agree to do this show, but I want all these people. And I think of the layers of how it is just to book guests now in a more modern era, for him to have that, for lack of a better word, that clout to invite these people and not have the pushback from the network. Would you say that NBC was very progressive during that time, or were they trendsetters? Because I can't imagine what the audience complaints might have been by people who are less progressive in their thinking.
Well, I don't think anybody was progressive back then. I think media companies were very conservative back then, right? And they were much more directly corporate sponsored. And so this also owes to the power of Johnny Carson. You know, Johnny Carson had the clout to say, this Black man's going to sit in for me for a week. And only probably Johnny Carson would have had the clout to do that, because the idea of, even Nat King Cole having a television series was considered controversial. Diane Carroll being on TV was considered controversial. Having a Black lead in a movie, God forbid, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? You know, there were places in the South that wouldn't play it, right? I mean, so this was, and when, Black actors would win awards, it was controversial. Win an Oscar, controversial. So, I think it was controversial. However, you also have to think about the fact that Harry Belafonte was walking into a room when he was making his pitch for who his guests were going to be that had no other Black people in it.
Right.
It's not like this was, these weren't diverse environments, in 1968. He's having to say to a room full of white men, because of course they were mostly and all white men, this is what I'm doing. And so you think about the bravery, the cojones, that he had to say, this is what I'm doing because Carson gave me the week and I'm doing what I want with it.
That's right. Looking at this project from the cradle to the grave now and learning all you had and spending time with Harry, how has this changed you personally as a journalist, as a producer, as just a Black person in America? How has this experience changed you?
Well, I have to say one of my favorite aspects of doing this project was the pre-interview with Mr. Belafonte. We got a chance to sit down with him, Joan Walsh and I, and the three of us that sort of came up with this idea for the project. We sat down with him, Valerie, Joan, and I, and Mr. Belafonte and his wife. And we just had lunch with them just to talk through what it would mean, what it would be like, what he would expect out of the project, what he, because he had a say, absolutely, and whether he'd do it,
Right.
and if he did it, how he wanted to see it come through and come about. And that was one of the best days ever, just being able to talk to him, to hear him tell the stories that he told, to be able to be there. And my husband and I were both there because he was, with me on the crew when we shot the interview where he looked at himself talking to Dr. King and thinking about the fact that, he was one of the last people to interview Dr. King, and just the emotion on his face as he thought about that and looked at himself at that time. It's such an honor just to really be in his presence. He's not only one of the greatest actors and greatest Hollywood figures of all time, but also just one of the greatest people and greatest civil rights figures. And he's a national treasure. And so just being able to do anything involving him, I think, was an honor.
And I can't even imagine just sitting in his presence and learning from him and just kind of seeing what the world looked like through his eyes. And lastly, before we wrap, did he have any parting words or share any thoughts about our current normal as compared to when he was experiencing it in the 50s and the 60s and his own civil rights?
Yeah, no, Mr. Belafonte is very opinionated. He's very opinionated about things that are going on now. And he's still an activist. He still believes that we need to do better, that we must do better, and that this isn't good enough. And I think that's one of the things I do respect about him. He recognizes that there have been changes. Obviously, he's been blessed, but he knows we can do better. And he demands and insists that we do better. And I agree with him.
I do too. Thank you so much for your time and honor. Wonderful, wonderful project. I can't wait to see all the eyes that are on it because I know a lot of people are going to learn a lot of things because I know I most certainly did.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I did too. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Take care.
Better shake your booties for Black girl nerves. Better shake your booties for Black girl nerves.